Welcome back, and thanks for tuning in today to our panel on turning experience data into action. I'm Billy Mitchell, Editor-in-Chief of FedScoop, and joining me is Chelsie Bright, Global Industry Leader for Qualtrics. Chelsie, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Billy. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I'm excited to talk about experience management in the government space. I think I'd like to start today's conversation with sort of a high-level view on the state of citizen, customer, you name it, experience management. There's a lot of different twists on experience management, experience management in the government space. So I'd love to start by maybe you could point us in some places where things are maybe going well, and maybe some places that can improve. Just give us a rundown of what things look like at the government level.
Yeah, great question, Billy. I think it's been pretty interesting over the past several years. We've seen experience management really take off in the public sector space in a new way. It's been around in the private sector world for quite a while, and a number of government agencies really globally are now looking and trying to understand how they can take some of the best practices that have been developed in the private sector world and apply those in a government setting. And to your point, when we think about experience data, really thinking about how do we collect and use feedback from all of the stakeholders that we work with in the government space, whether that's our employees, customers that might be other agencies or organizations that we serve, citizens, residents, members of the public, and really, thinking about those data points and the feedback that we're collecting from them and how we're going to be able to use that to continue to improve service delivery, the programs and policies that we're providing, and ultimately knowing that all of that work is impacting the relationship that we have with those stakeholders and the trust that they have in us. And so, as organizations are doing this, we've seen some really incredible innovators, across the spectrum doing some phenomenal work. I've been very encouraged in the last year. The Office of Management and Budget, for example, has stood up a CX practice, and they're even thinking about how you connect both customer experience and employee experience together, and providing some really great guidelines for federal agencies to use in developing out those practices. We've seen some encouraging work with US Census, where they are taking this quite literally and collecting feedback from Americans nationally and using that data to help understand people's sentiment around the pandemic that's going on right now, as well as how it's impacted people's mental health and their economics, and then using that feedback to kind of help inform federal agencies and responses. At the local level, we've got a number of great cities that are using feedback to improve service delivery, and they are also using that to help prioritize where we could do more with digital services and streamline government processes and operations. City of Orlando is an organization that has done some really phenomenal work in standing up their customer experience program, and then now an employee experience program, and connecting those together. And globally, we've seen some really fantastic examples. In Australia, it's become like a regular practice to have a minister of customer experience, right? So we've had the chance to work with New South Wales, a state there, and to help them build out that customer experience program as well. So I've been really encouraged just across the board, and feel fortunate to work with all the cabinet level federal agencies in some capacity, and over 350 state and local agencies as well.
Really cool. It's really cool to see it kind of pop up and grow to a new level of importance across the world, really, but especially here at home. One thing, we talk a lot about the citizen or the customer experience, but also there's the employee experience that's very important across the federal government. We hear about the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. It's a very powerful tool to sort of measure how employees are satisfied in their jobs and how engaged they are. So I'd be curious to hear, using this same sort of data, how can agencies better manage and measure this employee experience, and how does it sort of intersect with those same things we were just talking about, the customer and the citizen experience?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Feds, which I think is a pretty common example. Certainly at the federal level, people would be familiar with that, which is typically done as a annual survey. Things have been a little bit different this year, where you kind of go out and do this one-time push to collect all of that data, and you compile it, do the analysis, and like 6 months later, you get a report. And that's pretty typical, even at say state and local level, where we see that as a process. And one of the challenges that has really come to light this past year with the pandemic, with that type of a process, is that it's really hard to be agile and responsive to employee needs when you only have one point in time that's collected once a year. And you just can't be as actionable as you need to be to meet some of the employee needs. And we saw that this year as agencies moved to a work remote environment in many cases, have now started in some cases to kind of move back to on-person. Sometimes it's a hybrid mode. And it's, I think for a lot of employees, and myself included, has been kind of a disruptive year in terms of our typical workflows. And so we've seen that it becomes really important to have more frequent engagement with your employees and asking them for their feedback, and then using that to help prioritize and make decisions and kind of adjust your policies. And we've seen some really encouraging results with this. One of the agencies at the federal level that we partner with, they took this to heart and really have started like pulsing their employees, where they're regularly asking for feedback, and have seen some very impressive response rates where within like 3 hours of sending out a brief short feedback survey to their employees, saw like over 30% respond and give that feedback so that they could use that to help inform decisions. And I think for a number of agencies, they've found some really interesting insights there, where things and topics have surfaced that they didn't realize were concerns of their employees. Even small things, on the supplies and equipment that people have or don't have and need to be effective and truly driving some of those outcomes for the programs that they serve, have been important insights that have come up. And because the employee experience is so critical to delivering good customer experience and the types of services that we provide to members of the public, it really does become important to make sure that our employee needs are met, that they feel empowered, that they're engaged in part of the solution to many of the problems and challenges that we're dealing with right now.
So what role does technology play in all of this? Obviously, I think technology can be a driver for these services and optimizing them. But I'd love to hear your take on, it's almost 2021, and obviously technology has become such a big thing in this past year as we've all become less in person, more remote. So how is technology a driver for optimizing citizen services?
Yeah, I think especially this year with the pandemic and not being able to provide as many services in person, we've seen, this really acceleration and adoption of technology across governments, which has been very encouraging to see how fast so many organizations have innovated. A couple of areas that we've seen tremendous growth are really thinking through how can you automate and digitize a lot of the processes that may have been manual historically. And we've seen agencies even going and advocating for like legislative changes to make it easier to provide those services digitally. And if we think about the world that our stakeholders live in, it's a very digital world. You think about companies like Amazon that have completely transformed the way we shop online, and you can go and put something in your cart, and 2 hours later it'll show up on your doorstep. And those expectations that customers have also bleed over into the public sector, where they're coming to government agencies expecting more of those. And so I think as we think about this year and then even looking into the future, we're going to see more of a focus on providing services digitally and automating a lot of those manual processes, so that we're leveraging technology to do a lot of this, workflow modernization and kind of connecting of different data systems together, so that that's a seamless experience. And the really key thing here with all of this modernization is that we have to do that with the user perspective first and foremost, like really thinking about who is that end user that is engaging with us on these services, and how are we understanding their needs and optimizing this, not so that it meets kind of like a compliance-based or regulatory-based perspective, which is important, but how is it going to be for them to engage on it? And I think that becomes so important, because it's not just a matter of taking old processes and digitizing those exact same old processes, but really kind of giving us a chance to think about the process end to end and reinvent it and drive some really impressive innovation.
Very cool. Very cool. So, our conversation today, I think that the heart of a lot of it is the data piece. Data is so important. So I'd love to kind of turn to that now, and how agencies should think about gathering data so that it's actionable, and then, making sure that that there's actionable decision making that comes from what they're doing, because I think a lot of times they're not preparing in that way. So I'd love to get your thoughts on, when agents take to experience management and think about managing citizen and customer experience, how should they be thinking about the way they're gathering data, so that on the back end they're making quick and actionable iterative decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Billy. It's so critical. I think oftentimes when we think about collecting data, it's in the context of compiling a report or having dashboards, and that's an important first step to have that. But ultimately, if we're not taking action on the data that we're collecting from our stakeholders, if that data is just going into a black box, in many ways it does more to harm the relationship, and it kind of can decrease trust than build that up. So it really is important not only that we're taking action on it, but our stakeholders see the action that we're taking. We're being transparent and have that. You think about kind of the pulse survey that's happening with government agencies now, kind of checking in more frequently on their employees, especially if they're working from home. If you have a percentage of employees that have identified a pain point, maybe around connecting with like a VPN or something, and we don't do anything, take any action on that, that kind of further deteriorates
Yeah.
morale, and employees are less likely to try to provide feedback next time. And that same thing is true for our external stakeholders and residents and citizens, that when they see organizations taking action on the data and the feedback that they've provided, that's really powerful. I think oftentimes stakeholders have pretty low expectations across the board of governments, and they kind of expect almost that their feedback goes into a black box. And it's been really phenomenal to read comments that our customers, governments across and around the world, have provided back around what residents say when they actually provide that opportunity to provide feedback, but then also take action on it. And people are like so amazed when governments actually do that. And I think it really kind of fully closes the loop. And as we think about what that looks like moving into the future, I think it's having that full loop and that process in place where we're agile and nimble enough to take feedback, adapt our processes, take action on that, and continue to evolve the government services and programs that we have to kind of meet those end needs more holistically.
That's great. And I imagine, there's this current explosion of chief data officers within the federal government. So that'll be an important thing that they're going to want to keep an eye on as this moves forward. Chelsie, we have time, I think, for one last question. Speaking of CDOs, another role that I'm hearing a lot about in that C-level tier of government is a CXO, a Chief Experience Officer. We haven't seen a lot of them, but we've seen some, and we've heard some people, some stirrings maybe within the White House and OMB about maybe pushing in this direction a little bit more. So I'd love to get your thoughts on whether you think this is a good direction for the federal government to take, and if it were one where we started to see not only CIOs, CTOs, CDOs, but a CXO at every agency, what might you suggest they should emphasize and focus on as these roles pop up?
Yeah, it's been very encouraging to see this role start to formalize. And it's a question that we get a lot in terms of where this role sits. How important is this role? And to your point, I do think that it's critical that there's somebody that owns this work. This is hard to do, right? The idea that we're going to use feedback from stakeholders to drive organizational change and be incorporated into change management is a really big undertaking, because it requires so much focus at the agency level in terms of our business processes internally. And so as we think about that role, it's really having someone that's a champion for this work that can drive that cross-functionally across the organization, can get people on board. That's a big part of this, is just breaking down those silos where oftentimes we may be collecting some feedback or stakeholder experience, but we're not looking at that holistically across the organization. So that is a key function of this role, or even if it's not a formalized role, having someone that really owns and is responsible for collecting that customer feedback and really thinking about it. Another key thing there is standardizing across the board. So often we may be asking questions or some feedback, even a customer satisfaction question can be asked 50 different ways, probably more than that. So someone that can standardize that across the different services so that we're getting that holistic customer journey view and really thinking about the end-to-end experience for our users and how do we optimize that. And without that kind of central leadership, C-suite role, thinking across all of the different organizational structures that our customers come into contact, we often miss some of the pain points and gaps that customers are experiencing, because in our world and potentially the program that we're providing, we don't see those gaps in the same extent. So I think like that elevated role can have a huge difference. And then I would say, having a close partnership with the IT department, really, this is both a marriage of a partnership between developing a program and an organizational process inside. It's also about having the technology component to scale these programs. We cannot collect feedback at scale, whether from our employees or our external customers, without leveraging technology and meeting people where they are via text message, emails, kind of having that omni-channel, collecting feedback on social media, that becomes really important. So we've got to leverage technology to do it. And so that requires a really close partnership with, a chief data officer or the CIO as well.
I think this is going to be an area that is going to be very important in the coming years. And I'm glad we were able to have this conversation today, because I think it's important amongst the many conversations we're having this week at FedTalks. So Chelsie, I want to take the time to thank you for your insights today. It was a tremendous conversation, and I look forward to continuing it in the future.
Likewise, Billy, thank you so much for having me.